Hello, everybody. This is Professor Keegan, and I hope you're all safe and not getting shininged by the snow. Um, we are unfortunately unable to meet synchronously again this week due to a weather event. So I'm pushing everything, all this course content to you online and giving you another video lecture. Um, Unfortunately for us, the film we were scheduled to watch does not have a streaming license with the university. So it's kind of up to you to track it down on your own, if you would like to watch it. Of course, highly recommended. It's a great film. And it is our only Spanish language text. So those of you who are interested in Spanish language cinema, I would highly suggest checking it out if you haven't seen it. And it should be findable, but we don't have a streaming access to it here. So unfortunately, that's just how things are. Thank you, February. Anyway, I wanted to remind you of some things about the class structure and schedule before getting into the content, especially because we haven't met in 2 weeks now. Things are coming up. The first of which is that you have an assignment due next Thursday. This is basically by the next time we meet. I think I gave you to the end of day on it. So by the end of next Thursday, you're supposed to be turning in that preliminary rationale for your essay. So this is described on the syllabus also. So I would read about it, but I want to remind you that, this is an early kind of guesstimate, we would say, of kind of what you think you might be focusing on in your paper. That is to say, we understand that proposals are early, they can shift and change. Your thinking will likely shift and change as you read and work more in the class. So we're just looking for you to try out a couple of ideas about what you might be doing. It's fine to change them later. Um, the first step for this is to pick a section of the syllabus that you want to focus on. Well, we haven't covered everything so far, but you're getting a sense of the core structure, right? So, we're touching on major genre formations in popular film. Some of these genres are aesthetic modes that have been turned into genres in film studies or by film communities, right? So melodrama and comedy are much broader than just genres, but as films, there are genre cycles associated with them. And then, of course, noir is a style, but has kind of retroactively become a genre via its citation by neo-noir cycles that we've seen in the 80s, 90s, and kind of now too. Noir is having a bit of a revival again. So pick an area of the syllabus. We haven't covered everything. We're about to touch on some of my favorite stuff in the course, which is the speculative genres, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. I suspect a number of you will be picking the one of those, right? And the next thing to do is to choose two mini text from that genre to discuss in combination. Now, for most of the genre areas, I'm asking you to pick the thing from the syllabus that we've discussed together because you'll have a head start on some writing about it. Maybe if you've written a journal about that, and then one from the external list that's linked on Moodle. There are a number of options for each category. So you'll be writing about the thing we did in class and then adding another thing. Now, because I'm not able to provide you with a screening of Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, I'm making an exception for comedy, meaning if you'd rather do two of the things on the external list for comedy, you are welcome to, because I haven't been able to guarantee that you could see the Almodovar film. Okay, so pick two, and then turn in 250 words about um, your kind of choice, why you've chosen them, and what you hope to explore. And that is unpacked on the syllabus as well. So that's due by the end of next Thursday. And it's really just a check to make sure you're starting to think about the essay. Okay? So send any questions about that. Now, I want to talk briefly about comedy for those of you who especially want to focus on it. We have a little bit of reading also on this specific film by Evans, right? To think through, I kind of put this film right after melodrama to show you how a text can combine melodramatic and comedic genre conventions in a way that kind of produces a queer or camp ironization of them both. So there's a reason why we're following melodrama with comedy, particularly looking at this film, and then we go to romance to end the first half of class. So let's talk a bit about comedy as a mode, right? Much like melodrama, comedy is a very broad narrative mode, and aesthetic mode, of which there are film genre subtypes, right? So when we talk about comedy as genre, we're talking about it internal to film production and reception. But of course, we understand that comedy is a much broader sensibility that we see going very far back in history, cultural history. And the principal aspect of comedy isn't necessarily that it's funny, right? But that it tracks an amusing conflict or agon, to use the Greek, right? Because this is a form that we see particularly in Greek theater. This conflict between groups that is eventually resolved in a surprising or delightful manner, right? Um, so again, much like the musical, which is a comedic genre. Comedies tend to resolve in narrative closure and resolution of a problem. Um, and that makes them comedic versus tragic, which I'll talk about in a second. So, we see this form originating primarily in Greek theater, and a lot of the conventions of comedy are borrowed from Greek theater and then show up in European theater and then in cinema, and much like when we talk about the organization of, say, Shakespearean plays between comedies, tragedies, and histories, right? Comedy is actually the inverse of tragedy. So if we're going to talk about tragic form tends to emphasize irresolvable problems, problems that aren't resolved by the plot of the actual text, right? And usually they're irresolvable because the character has a tragic flaw that can't be overcome, right? Or events are kind of fated to take place, and there's some kind of lesson we're supposed to learn from the inevitability of the tragedy happening. So there's a commentary on, say, politics or, culture because of this irresolvability. And so what happens is in a tragedy, they tend to end with like the character being ruined or the social body being punished or, some kind of um uh corrupt ending that demonstrates, right, the flaw. So, you can kind of broadly categorize genres as either tragic or comedic. We could say that melodrama, which we just looked at, tragic, right? Portrait of a Lady on Fire does not end with a resolution. It ends with a suspension and is much more interested in revealing through the conditions of impossibility the problems of sexism and patriarchy rather than giving us a happy ending where those problems are overcome, right? So we could say melodrama, generally tragic, the musical, generally comedic, right? Because comedic form emphasizes the resolution of problems via pro-social events like marriage, generally, right? Traditionally, a comedy would end in a marriage or some kind of celebration. Um, through which a sort of institutionality is restored, corruption is banished, and we get a happy ending, right? So in this sense, many types of films are broadly aesthetically comedic, meaning that they emphasize resolution and end by upholding a reformed social order. You think about the musical, which we just discussed, right? How in the musical generally this male-female parallelism that's part of the structure of a musical ends up resolving in a hierarchy internal to a marriage, right? That resolves the tension of the parallel. That's comedic in its basic structures. The romantic comedy is another example of a comedic subgenre in which differences between the couple are resolved, like worked through and problematized and then resolved via their eventual pairing in a relationship. And often those differences are linguistic, gendered, class differences are very classic focus of rom-coms, right? But the whole point is to work out and resolve those class differences by each character learning from the other. So comedy broadly is about resolution of those problems. Now, um, so it's important to understand that comedy broadly as a mode is not necessarily funny. Okay. That comes along later with the advent of like cinematic comedy. And also, things like comedians, like stand-up comedy, right? Um, the comedic mode actually emphasized resolution rather than funniness. It's just that now it has come to mean like any text that produces laughter, right? And we expect a comedy to make us laugh if it's a genre comedy. So, as a genre, which is a more specific cluster of features we find in cinematic comedies, right? There are many, many subgenres of comedy. In fact, there's no sort of single overarching comedy category, right? When we watch a comedy, we want to know what kind of subgenre it is. Some examples would be slapstick, which is a very early form, right? Kind of common even before film sound, using the body to create humor. The screwball, which is a cross-class style comedy, often emphasizing romance. The romantic comedy that we know today, a comedy of manners, right, where sort of polite society is mocked. The situation comedy, which is common in televisual formats, right? The buddy comedy, which is one of the few forms of comedy that's actually traditionally sort of masculine in form. The black comedy, which is unusual and then it promises to resolve and then doesn't resolve the problems that it explores. And then sort of like broader comedy stylizations like parodies and farces, right? So comedy is very diverse. There are lots of types. Now, despite all these types, we can talk about some core similarities, right? So when we're talking about film comedy, what we often expect to see is a collection of these characteristics. One, a tradition originating out of a stage tradition of theatrical comedy, right? We expect certain kinds of staginess from a film comedy that originate with theater. Um, Subgenres of comedy tend to be gendered, right? The broad category of comedy, not really. It's too diverse. But if we get into those subgenres, we start to get more gendered kind of pockets of conventions. So, for example, the rom-com is thought of as feminine, whereas the dark or black comedy is thought of as masculine, right? Um, the agon or conflict that is central to a comedy is amusing rather than scary, right? Or upsetting. It's an amusing conflict. And it's explored via a narrative structure that plays up resolvable differences between classes, genders, races, or other oppositional groups. This is true even with the buddy comedy, where you can't really have a buddy comedy where the two dudes are too similar to each other. They have to be different. And that difference has to produce some kind of amusing scenario that will eventually be worked through, right? Some lack of communal understanding about something that it comes out of their difference. Generally, for buddy comedies, it's usually race in a North American context, right? Um, and so we have this amusing conflict explored via oppositional positions of these pairings that through them the problem is worked through and resolved in an amusing and delightful way. There is a complex narrative that implies, frustrates, and then delivers a resolution to a seemingly intractable problem, with the exception being dark or black comedy, where the problem isn't resolved, which is a sort of different and more kind of postmodern take on the comedy as a genre formation. Humor is used to reveal social or institutional paradoxes that are commonly overlooked in real life. We get to laugh at things in comedies that in reality we usually just have to put up with, right? Um, or characters on screen will do things that are delightful because we can't do them in reality. They would be too risky, right? Um, and there's usually strong use of the physical body to violate rules of propriety enforced under public and private spatial codes. This is especially true for things like slapstick comedy, and sort of like what we would call like gross out comedy, right? Where the normal rules that apply to our bodies in social space are don't apply to the bodies of the people on screen. And so it's delightful to see them doing things that we would be socially punished for doing. And of course, this is a tradition in film that goes all the way back to silent film, where the body on screen was really, really important. Its movements, early trick films and other kinds of cinematography that invented ways for the body to do fantastic things on screen that couldn't be done in reality. So things like visual gags, the pratfall, stunts are used in comedy to accentuate the confusion and chaos produced by the plot. And comedies often also include breakdowns in communication, produced and emphasized via highly stylized or overly complex dialogue. And this is particularly true of the screwball comedy, which is that fast talking kind of 30s style wise guy comedy where a man and a woman usually are paired together romantically but aren't from the same class. I think of classics like The Lady Eve or His Girl Friday, or contemporary examples like the Gilmore Girls, that are working in a screwball tradition. This highly developed, complex dialogue is crucial to the humor, but also to the confusion that then produces these delightful surprises in the plot. And lastly, we have high use of dramatic irony, right? Because often the audience will know more than the characters and will see the characters making mistakes or getting confused, and that's pleasing to the audience to know more than the characters. And a happy ending in which the driving conflict is resolved, but often in an unexpected way, right? Rather than a resolution we can see coming a mile away, a comedy will often produce one kind of in a delightful, surprising manner, right? Sort of like what you don't expect to happen. So, yeah, and depending on subgenre, the different aspects of these characteristics can be more or less present, right? So comedy is actually pretty complicated, even though we think of it as a rather low form that's just designed to entertain and make us laugh. It's how the laughter is produced via these characteristics that makes comedy actually really difficult to make and really difficult to make well, which is why there are so few really good comedies. So, I want to talk a bit about this reading by Alex Doty. Alex Doty is one of the founders of queer film and cultural studies. And the piece we're reading is from in the early 90s. So keep in mind that he's writing about a period of time when there weren't a lot of gay characters on screen. Um, and he's making an interesting argument that I think helps us think formally about comedy. Um, right? He's using this new what was at that time a new this new idea, queer, right? He's using it to talk about experiences of cinema as not tied to queer identity or to queer content. So he's saying that the actual structure of certain cinematic forms produces queerness because of how they take us out of our expected relationships to sex and gender. And that this is the case not just for queer people watching, that's my cat. But for anyone watching, and you don't have to be a gay, lesbian, bi, or trans person to have queer experiences, and that content, right, f film or cinematic content doesn't have to be representationally gay or lesbian, bi, or trans to produce these queer moments either. So he's arguing for queerness in the relationship between the viewer and media form, right? Rather than content or identity. And I think this serves us very well when we go to watch a film like Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, and we were like, this movie is super queer but doesn't have queer characters, right? How is it effectuating queerness via its formal interventions? This is something that Doty can help us analyze. So Doty argues instead that any text can contain queer moments and that any viewer can experience queer meaning regardless of identity. And he's actually promoting this as an experience. And he says that and this takes us back to the first day of class too, when we talked about the queer and trans properties of cinema itself, that that cinema produces these queer moments and even straight people appreciate them. Like there's something liberating about film or moving image media that allows us to get outside of the identity formations assigned to us in the real world, right? And so queer pleasure is an important part of why even straight people or cis people watch movies. So he writes, the queer often operates within the non-queer, right? And that would be the main argument here. But also he says the non-queer operates within the queer, right? There are representations of gay, lesbian, bi, trans identity that are not particularly formally interesting and that tend to actually reproduce dominant understandings of sex and gender versus resistant ones. So just because we have a gay character doesn't necessarily mean the text is queer in the sense of pushing against norms. It could be quite conservative in its own way, right? So the queer is often present in texts that we assume don't have any queer content, right? And the things that we think of as representing queer people, right, can often be formally quite conservative. So Doty writes that queer erotics are already at the center of culture. They're not some kind of marginal, recently discovered thing, and they're not attached to only gay and lesbian viewing practices, but to cinema in general. He says they're already here and present at the center of culture as the thing against which straightness is constructed, like straightness requires queerness in order to define itself as not queer, right? Um, and as a position that anyone, regardless of identity, can find themselves in based on how a moving image media text manipulates conventions of sex and gender. So Doty notes how the structures of certain genres, one that we've covered already, melodrama, and one we're going to look at, horror, right, support queer affects or feelings because they exploit the spectacle of traditional sex and gender gone awry, right? This something going out of whack, something doing something it's not supposed to do, whether feelings are too intense, bodies are not doing the things they're supposed to do. Or, I mean, even in the case of a comedy, when you get a comedy of manners or a farce, right? Um, Something is wrong with the balance of the plot, or like people are not acting like they should be, and that's the source of the humor, right? And so Doty is arguing that certain genre formations produce these pleasures and spectacles that are queer in the way that they frustrate or challenge traditional sex and gender norms. So he writes, in this sense, enjoyment of certain genres is always already perverse or queer for all viewers, not the property of LGBTQ audiences necessarily, but built into the experience of the text. So Doty writes that queer media reception isn't outside straight reception practices, but instead inside, within, and alongside them, right? That we as viewers toggle in and out of different kinds of reception modes when we watch something. And queer media reception isn't this separate cultural practice. It's something that's interwoven with the way that straight reception practices are conducted. So this is one of the early kind of interventions in queer media studies that like to have queer media isn't about having a queer viewer or having queer representation. It's about formal structures and how they produce relationships to sex and gender. So he says queer readings of text are not alternative, but have been possible and present all along, right? And they're not new either. They've always been possible within the mechanics of cinema. Now, I gave you a small piece of the next chapter because he does talk a bit about comedy as well as being inherently queer, right? He writes that, comedy has this like frustrated relationship with LGBTQ audiences because we're often made fun of, right? Like jokes and comedies are often about us as objects of scorn or, as pathetic jokes, right? And so for queer viewers, a comedy is a little bit like, okay, can I allow myself to just fully give myself over to this text, or am I going to also keep some part of my consciousness outside the text, watching for these moments where I'm going to be have to remind myself that I'm not the thing being joked about, right? So there's a sort of meta relationship that queer and trans viewers can have to comedic media, right? So he says that queer enjoyment of comedic text is about being simultaneously inside and outside, as well as alongside the process of comedy production and interpretation, meaning we reserve some awareness or separate understanding of our identities outside the text's references to LGBTQ sex and gender, right? When somebody jokes about a trans person in a comedy, I have to remind myself that, like, okay, but I'm not the thing they're joking about. They have some preconception of transness that is in the text, but not in me, right? So there's a separation there. But there's also this alongside moment where queer fans will create paratextual relationships with comedic texts in order to decide which ones are actually deserve to be thought of as funny, which ones are safe to watch, which ones are are part of queer culture versus not, right? There's this kind of cultural push and pull around like who are our people and who are making comedy that's open to queer viewership. So, Doty writes, despite its content often being homo or transphobic, he writes that the form of comedy is nonetheless queer. And again, note the difference between form and content here. He writes, as a genre, comedy is fundamentally queer since it encourages rule breaking, risk taking, inversions, and perversions in the face of straight patriarchal norms, right? That the form of comedy's humor, the way it produces humor, is queer in relationship to dominant understandings of how things should be. Okay? So, despite the narrative resolutions and dismissals often used to close the comedic text back down, right, to resolve its chaos, he writes that queerness is often the source of the humorous pleasure in a comedy. The things that happen in a comedy that delight and move the plot forward are often these queer moments where things don't operate the way we expect them to. And the major mode in which this happens, um, this inside, outside, alongside praxis of queer humor is something called camp, right? Queer humor tends to ironize the artificial expectations that heterosexuality naturalizes, um, via one, excessive stylization, and two, exaggerations of straightness. And this is what we traditionally call camp aesthetics. And so camp is an aesthetic practice when we're thinking about queer produced media, but it's also a reception practice when we're watching something maybe not made for queer people and we're ironizing it, right? We're saying, oh, these characters think they believe so deeply in their the signs of straightness, but look at how artificial they actually are. Look at all of the gaps and holes in straightness where it doesn't make sense. It isn't logical, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about ironizing the artificiality of heterosexuality. Heterosexuality likes to tell this story that it's the natural sexuality and that queerness is the fake one, right? Or that cisness likes to pretend that its gender is real and transness is fake. But if we look carefully, we can see that straightness and cisness too are constructing and pretending that they are natural when really they're just as much the result of cultural performance as any other gender or sexuality, right? And so camp helps us poke holes in straightness and cisness. And I would argue that it's a valuable lens to bring to Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown because Almodovar is definitely using that collision between the high emotion of melodrama and the low amusement of comedy, that tension to show how silly straightness is, right? It's putting it under a lot of genre pressure and pushing and pulling it up and down this scale, this genre scale, right? Um, so I gave you a little bit from Evans about this film just to get you thinking about the way it's using genre, right? He says that one major feature of the film is its precarious balance between melodrama and comedy as genres, each of them used to heighten the effects of the other. And I would say that not only does it have this precarious genre balance, but it puts heterosexuality in this very precarious balance as well. Puts it under all this genre pressure to kind of destroy its traditional understandings of itself, right? Um, so I'll let you think about that if you're going to watch this, but I find that thinking about how genre is pushing and pulling gender and sexuality around in this film really useful as a lens. Um, Historically, it's important to understand that the film comes out in the late 80s, about a decade after Spanish fascism had fallen, under which film had been highly censored. And so sex and gender were suddenly kind of freed from this kind of top-down fascist control and could kind of do anything it wanted, right? Like sex and gender were kind of like made fluid in a way that opened up a lot of the codes of cinema in Spanish cinema in new ways. So this particular setting allows the film to explore the confusion produced when we get new old expressions of sex and gender. Like there are people in the film that represent these more fascist um, or traditionally fascistly enforced understandings of sex and gender. And then we have like these new meanings of sex and gender, and they're clashing together and they're producing all this emotion and situational comedy, right? And there's whether we're in comedy or we're in melodrama, it kind of is hard to tell sometimes because excitement and terror are very similar, right? Anxiety and excitement feel the same way. It just depends on which genre you're in. So, this is a quote from Almodovar I found really useful for thinking about the film and its ambiguity, right? Almodovar says in an interview quoted in Evans, right? High comedy includes elements from terror or adventure movies. A million things happen all at once, and the lives of the leading characters are usually hanging by a thread. The tension is never produced by blood, and the characters, although they hate each other, hardly ever commit murder, even though they act as if they're capable of doing so, right? So when we look at this film, it's like the energies are very much um the energies are accentuated in a melodramatic way, right? Like in the sense that you should be aware that horror is a foundationally melodramatic genre, right? It's a tragic form, it's melodramatic, but it works through all of the heightened emotion via violence, right? Versus longing, right? The excess in horror is about blood and violence and the destruction of the human body versus like what we saw in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But they're both fundamentally melodramatic, um, textual approaches. So taking that melodrama of like the horror film and pushing it up against the comedy and saying, aren't these kind of the same in some ways? Um, right? This confusion between genre, you could argue is a very queer situation that this film puts its characters and us, the viewers, in, right? So for those of you who are able to access this and really want to like do something on Spanish language cinema or do something on comedy and want to look at this film, there are a few questions I have that you could pursue here, right? Which is one, what makes the film queer? Yes, Almodovar is a gay director, but nothing in the film is necessarily gay, right? Um, and yet, we might apply Doty here to think about film form and generic structure and how Almodovar is using those to produce confusion, delightful collisions, chaos, right? And an ambiguity about what the excess of feeling is supposed to be or mean, right? In the context of a country that had just come out of a fascist dictatorship, right? Where the characters really are kind of figuring out how to map affect onto events. Um, how does film undermine or accentuate the borders of genre, right? Especially since we just looked at melodrama, you should see some of those things in this film too, but pushed up against the comedic. And how does it use camp, right? How is it denaturalizing the things that are taken seriously as real under heteronormative narrativity? Okay. So for those of you who want to watch this and want to turn in a journal on it, those are there for you to explore. You don't necessarily have to, but jumping off points, I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me. And just a reminder that next class you have preliminary rationale due by the end of the day. And of course, we will be going over um, the reading I'll drop into Moodle on romance. And there will also be another reading team. Um, because we're not together this week, I would ask you to review what the reading intro team has put into that Google Doc to help you process this lecture. Okay? So thank you very much. I hope you stay safe during the snowstorm, and we will hopefully finally see each other again next week for romance and the film Happy Together by Wong Kar-wai. Thanks.